Medieval times weren't just knights and kings. People lived in all kinds of ways, from barely getting by to having more than they could ever use. This is a look at every level of wealth back then, what it meant to have something or nothing. At the very bottom were the ones nobody wanted to be. Beggars existed in a world where every single day was a fight for survival, where the next meal was never guaranteed, and where death could come from hunger, cold, or disease at any moment. These people had absolutely nothing. No land, no job, no family to support them, and no hope of climbing out of their desperate situation. They slept wherever they could find shelter, against church walls, hoping for morning charity, in ditches by the roadside, or huddled near town gates where merchants might toss them scraps. Their bedroom was basically wherever the wind wasn't trying to freeze them to death. Most beggars ended up in this position through terrible luck rather than choice. Some were born with disabilities that made work impossible. Others had been injured in accidents or gotten sick with diseases that left them unable to earn a living. War veterans who lost limbs in battle often found themselves begging because there were no support systems. The daily routine of a beggar was exhausting and dangerous. They would wake up wherever they had managed to sleep and immediately start looking for food. This meant begging at church doors, especially during morning prayers when people felt most generous. They positioned themselves near markets, hoping merchants would give them spoiled food rather than throw it away. Food for beggars was whatever they could get their hands on. Moldy bread, rotten vegetables, scraps from tavern floors, or bones with tiny bits of meat still clinging to them. They weren't exactly dining at five-star restaurants unless you count the dirt floor as ambient lighting. Many suffered from malnutrition, which made them weak and more likely to get sick. Disease spread quickly among beggars because they lived in such terrible conditions. They couldn't afford medicine or even basic health care. A simple cut could become infected and kill them. During plague outbreaks, beggars died in huge numbers because they had no way to protect themselves. People in medieval times had mixed feelings about beggars. Some Christians believed that giving to the poor was a religious duty. However, many townspeople saw beggars as lazy troublemakers who brought crime and disease. The weather was a constant enemy, especially winter when many froze to death. Despite all these hardships, some beggars developed remarkable survival skills. They learned which towns were more generous and when religious festivals meant better charity. But even the smartest beggar faced an almost impossible challenge in trying to escape poverty. However, there were people who managed to earn just slightly more than nothing by working for others. Just above beggars were the landless laborers and servants, people who had managed to secure work but owned practically nothing. These were the human workhorses of medieval society, doing the jobs that nobody else wanted while earning barely enough to survive. Unlike beggars who had to scrounge for every meal, laborers and servants at least knew where their next food was coming from. They worked directly for lords, wealthy farmers, or successful craftsmen in exchange for meals, basic shelter, and sometimes a few coins. It was like having a job where your boss pays you in leftovers and a place to sleep. The work was backbreaking and never-ending. Male laborers spent their days hauling heavy loads, digging ditches, clearing forests, building walls, and mucking out stables. Female servants cleaned houses, cooked meals, washed clothes by hand, and cared for children. Both worked from sunrise to sunset with very few breaks. Their living conditions were only slightly better than sleeping outdoors. Servants often slept in the kitchens or storage rooms of their master's house, sometimes sharing space with animals. Laborers might get a corner of a barn or a tiny shed, barely big enough to lie down in. The food they received was basic but filling. Servants usually ate the same meals as their employers, though they got smaller portions. Laborers might receive bread, porridge, ale, and occasionally some cheese or eggs. It wasn't fancy, but it was regular. These workers were about as replaceable as paper towels. If they got injured, sick, or complained too much, their employers could easily find someone else desperate enough to take their place. This kept wages low and working conditions terrible. Seasonal work was common, especially in farming communities. During planting and harvest seasons, demand for laborers was high, but during winter, many were laid off and had to survive on whatever they had saved or find temporary work elsewhere. Despite the hard work, some laborers and servants were able to save tiny amounts of money over time. A few coins here and there, maybe kept hidden in their clothes or buried somewhere safe. They were basically medieval piggy banks, except the piggy was their pocket and the bank was a hole in the ground. The smart ones learned skills while they worked. A servant might pick up cooking techniques or learn to read and write by watching their master's children get lessons. These skills sometimes help them find better jobs later. While steady work means security, some people yearn for something more: the freedom to make their own deals and choose their own fate. They were technically free people who could move around and make their own decisions, but they owned absolutely no land and had to work other people's property to survive. These peasants were different from laborers and servants because they worked as independent contractors rather than employees. Instead of getting steady meals and shelter, they negotiated deals with landowners to work their fields in exchange for a share of the crops. They were basically medieval freelancers, except instead of working from coffee shops, they worked in muddy fields for grain. The arrangements landless peasants made varied widely depending on who owned the land and how desperate the peasant was for work. Some deals were relatively fair. The peasant might keep half of what they grew. Other agreements were heavily stacked against the worker, with the landowner taking most of the harvest. Their housing situation was precarious because they never knew how long they could stay in one place. Most lived in tiny huts they built themselves using whatever materials they could find: mud, straw, wood scraps, and stones. When a work arrangement ended, they often had to abandon their home and start over somewhere else. Food for landless peasants came mainly from what they could grow or earn through their labor. Their diet consisted mostly of boiled grains like barley or oats, root vegetables, dried beans, and occasionally some eggs or milk. Their meal planning was basically, what didn't die today that I can eat? The uncertainty of their situation created constant stress. Unlike peasants who owned permanent plots, landless peasants never knew if their current arrangement would last through the next season. A landowner might decide to hire someone else or simply kick them out with no notice. Weather and crop failures hit landless peasants especially hard because they had no reserves to fall back on. If the harvest was bad, they might receive barely enough food to survive the winter. If it failed completely, they faced starvation. Many landless peasants traveled constantly, moving from place to place looking for work opportunities. They were like medieval nomads, except instead of following herds of animals, they followed rumors of available farmland. Despite their hardships, landless peasants had more freedom than many other people in medieval society. They weren't tied to a particular lord like serfs were. If they didn't like their current situation, they could pack up and leave to find something better. But not everyone chose the backbreaking path of farming to make their way in the world. Some preferred to earn their living through entirely different means. Minstrels lived one of the most unpredictable lifestyles in medieval times. They could go from performing for kings to sleeping in ditches depending on their luck and talent. These traveling entertainers made their living through songs, stories, poetry, juggling, and other performances. Unlike peasants who were tied to agricultural work, minstrels had chosen a life of complete uncertainty in exchange for creative freedom. They were basically medieval rock stars, except their tour bus was their own 2 feet, and their recording contract was whatever people felt like tossing into their hat. The life of a minstrel required genuine skill and courage. They had to memorize hundreds of songs and stories, many of which were incredibly long and complex. Popular tales could take hours to tell completely, with intricate plots involving kings, knights, magical creatures, and epic battles. Their instruments were their most valuable possessions and tools of trade. A good lute, harp, or set of pipes could mean the difference between success and failure. Minstrels guarded these instruments carefully because replacing them was expensive and difficult. Travel was constant and dangerous for minstrels. They walked from town to town, castle to castle, and fair to fair, carrying everything they owned on their backs. Roads were full of bandits who saw traveling entertainers as easy targets. Minstrels had to be part performer, part athlete, and part escape artist just to survive getting from one gig to the next. The payment system was completely unpredictable. Sometimes a generous lord would reward a good performance with gold coins, fine clothes, or even a horse. Other times audiences would pay with meals, ale, or simply a warm place to sleep for the night. Minstrels served important functions beyond entertainment in medieval society. They were living newspapers, carrying news and gossip from town to town before printing presses existed. People eagerly gathered around minstrels, not just for entertainment, but to learn what was happening in the wider world. Social acceptance varied wildly, depending on the situation. At royal courts or noble feasts, skilled minstrels were welcome guests. In some towns, however, they were viewed as vagabonds and troublemakers. They were simultaneously loved and hated, like medieval reality TV stars. The competition among minstrels was fierce because there were always more entertainers than paying audiences. To stand out, minstrels specialized in different types of performances. Some focused on heroic ballads, others told romantic stories or performed comedy acts. Seasonal patterns affected minstrel income dramatically. Summer months were good because people held outdoor festivals and celebrations. Winter was much harder because people stayed indoors and had less money area near the house and space for a few animals. The house itself was usually a simple structure made from whatever materials were available locally: wood planks, mud bricks, stone, or even turf. The daily routine of smallholding peasants revolved completely around their land and animals. They woke up before dawn to milk cows or goats, feed chickens, and check on their crops. Most of their day was spent working in the fields, plowing, planting, weeding, or harvesting, depending on the season. Food production was the main focus because these peasants grew most of what they ate. Their diet was simple but more varied than landless people could afford. They had vegetables from their gardens, grain from their fields, milk and eggs from their animals, and occasionally meat when they slaughtered an older animal. The livestock kept by smallholding peasants was modest but essential. A single cow provided milk and eventually meat. A few chickens gave eggs and could be eaten during special occasions. Some kept goats or pigs, which were easier to feed than cows. Tools and equipment were precious possessions for smallholding peasants. They owned plows, hoes, sickles, axes, and other farming implements that were essential for working their land. Their tool shed was basically their small business inventory. Weather was still a major concern because crop failures could ruin a smallholding peasant's entire year. However, they had some advantages. They could make decisions about what to plant, when to plant it, and how to care for their crops. Trade and bartering were important parts of economic life. They might trade extra vegetables for tools, exchange grain for cloth, or barter services with neighbors. Some sold surplus produce at local markets, earning small amounts of coin. Community relationships were vital because smallholding peasants couldn't afford to hire help during busy seasons. Neighbors worked together during harvest time and helped each other build houses or barns. The neighborhood watch was basically everyone watching everyone else's crops and livestock. The dream of most smallholding peasants was to expand their holdings, buy more land, or see their children advance to better positions in society. Yet owning land came with responsibilities that some found overwhelming: the need to organize others and answer to higher authorities. The position of village reeve was both a blessing and a curse. It offered slightly better living conditions and some authority, but it also made the holder responsible for enforcing unpopular rules and collecting taxes from their own neighbors. Most reeves were selected rather than volunteering for the job. Lords typically chose peasants who could read and write basic numbers, had shown leadership skills, and were trusted by the community. Getting picked as reeve was like being elected class president, except your classmates were armed with farm tools and your job was to make them pay their taxes. The reeve's main responsibilities included organizing farm work on the lord's land, collecting rents and taxes from villagers, settling minor disputes, and reporting problems to higher authorities. During planting and harvest seasons, they coordinated labor crews and made sure work was completed on schedule. Housing for reeves was typically better than average peasant accommodations. They might get a larger house with extra rooms, better construction materials, or prime location within the village. Some lords provided furniture or better cooking equipment that marked the reeves' elevated status. The food situation improved for reeves because they received extra portions of grain, meat, or other supplies as payment for their services. During feast days, reeves often ate at the lord's table or received special dishes not available to ordinary peasants. Authority came with significant challenges for reeves. They had to enforce rules that were often unpopular, such as requiring peasants to work on the lord's fields instead of their own during crucial farming periods. They were basically medieval middle managers, trying to keep everyone happy while following orders from above. Relationships within the village became complicated for reeves. Some peasants resented their authority and accused them of favoritism. Others tried to bribe reeves with gifts to get better work assignments or reduced tax obligations. Record-keeping was a crucial part of the job that required basic literacy and math skills. Reeves maintained lists of who lived in the village, what they owed in taxes or labor, when work was completed, and how much grain was harvested. Legal responsibilities included presiding over minor court cases involving village disputes. Reeves heard complaints about stolen chickens, property line disagreements, and petty crimes. They were like medieval judges, except their courtroom was usually under a tree, and their law degree came from life experience. Seasonal pressures were intense for reeves because agricultural work had to be coordinated precisely. During planting season, they organized work crews. Harvest required even more coordination because crops had to be gathered quickly before weather damaged them. The job security of reeves depended entirely on their performance and the lord's satisfaction. A reeve who consistently collected taxes on time and maintained village productivity could hold the position for many years. While reeves gained respect through appointed authority, others sought a different kind of power. Freemen occupied a unique position in medieval society. They were legally free individuals who owned their own property and made their own decisions, but they weren't wealthy enough to be considered upper class. The most important characteristic of freemen was their legal status. Unlike serfs who were bound to their lord's land, freemen could move wherever they wanted, marry whom they chose, and make their own decisions about work and business. They were basically medieval entrepreneurs, except their startup capital was usually a cow and some farming tools. Freemen typically owned small farms, workshops, or shops that provided their income. A freeman farmer might own several fields, a house, barn, and various livestock. Freeman craftsmen owned the tools and materials needed for their trades. Blacksmiths had forges and anvils. Carpenters had saws and chisels. The tax situation for freemen was more complex because they paid money rather than providing labor services. They owed taxes to local lords, fees to use roads and markets, and tithes to the church. Their tax season lasted pretty much all year, since medieval governments were about as efficient at collection as modern ones are at spending. Property rights were real and protected for freemen. They could buy and sell land, pass property to their children, and use their assets as collateral for loans. This security encouraged freemen to invest in improvements to their land and businesses. Business activities for freemen were diverse and often specialized. Some focused on agriculture, growing crops for sale at markets rather than just subsistence. Others learned skilled trades like metalworking, leather crafting, brewing, or textile production. Market participation was crucial for freemen's success. They regularly attended local markets and fairs to sell their products and buy supplies they couldn't produce themselves. Their business networking happened at actual markets instead of coffee shops, and their presentations were just showing people their actual products. Social mobility was possible for freemen in ways that weren't available to lower classes. Successful freemen could accumulate enough wealth to buy more land, expand their businesses, or even purchase minor titles. Political participation was limited but real for freemen. They could vote in town meetings, serve on juries, and participate in local courts. Some were elected to minor civic positions like town watchman or market inspector. Education levels among freemen were higher than among peasants because they needed literacy and math skills for business. Many could read contracts, keep account books, and write letters. Military obligations were part of freeman life because they were expected to serve in local militias. They provided their own weapons and armor, which could be expensive. Housing quality for freemen was noticeably better than peasant accommodations. They could afford large houses with multiple rooms, better construction materials, and more furniture. Some free men, however, discovered that even greater wealth lay in a different approach. Merchants were the risk takers of medieval society, people who built their wealth by buying goods in one place and selling them somewhere else for a profit. Their success depended on understanding markets, managing dangerous journeys, and having enough courage to invest their money in ventures that could either make them rich or leave them broke. The merchant lifestyle was fundamentally different from the agricultural focus that dominated most medieval occupations. Instead of growing things or making things, merchants moved things from where they were cheap to where they were expensive. They were basically medieval logistics experts, except their delivery trucks were ox-drawn wagons and their GPS was asking strangers for directions. Successful merchants specialized in different types of goods depending on their location and connections. Some focused on luxury items like spices, silk, or precious metals that were lightweight but extremely valuable. Others dealt in bulk commodities like salt, grain, or wool that were needed in large quantities. Travel was the most dangerous and expensive part of merchant life. Roads were full of bandits who specifically targeted merchant caravans because they carried valuable goods and money.